The girl had no reason to stop that night, no reason to save the bleeding stranger sprawled beside the dusty trail. But when he whispered her name, a name he shouldn't have known, something inside her froze. She dragged him onto her horse, risking her life to bring him home, patching his wounds through trembling hands. By morning, he was gone, leaving behind only a blood-stained note and a silver badge older than her father's grave. When she showed it to the sheriff, his face turned white. "Where did you get this?" he asked. That badge belonged to a man who died 20 years ago. From that moment, she realized the truth she'd find next wouldn't just change her life. It would unravel everything she thought she knew. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. For a long moment, the only sound in the sheriff's office was the creak of the wind against the warped window pane and the faint rattle of the badge trembling in his hand. The old man's eyes, usually sharp and steady as a rifle barrel, had gone glassy, unfocused, like he was staring through the years instead of at the small, blood-stained star before him. His lips moved soundlessly before the words finally found breath. "That belongs to Marshal Ethan Cole," he whispered, the name cracking like dry wood in the quiet. "Dead since the Canyon Massacre." The last two words seemed to drain the room of air. Clara stood frozen, her palms damp, her heartbeat loud in her ears. "What massacre?" she asked, but the sheriff didn't answer right away. He set the badge down on his desk like it might bite him, then backed away a step, rubbing a trembling hand over his stubbled jaw. "Lord above," he muttered, eyes darting toward the door as though afraid the name itself might summon something unholy. "You weren't supposed to find this girl." Clara swallowed hard, the chill crawling up her spine until it settled behind her ribs like ice. "I didn't find it," she said softly. "He gave it to me." The sheriff froze. "He? The man on the trail," she said. "He was dying. He said my name like he knew me, and when I woke up, he was gone. Only that badge was left." The sheriff's mouth twitched, a grimace more than a smile. "Ain't possible," he said, his voice low and tight. "Marshal Cole's been dead 20 years. I saw the body myself, or what was left of it. They never found the badge." His eyes flicked to hers, searching, frightened. "You're sure you ain't making sport of me? Would I ride 12 miles through the dark for a joke?" she shot back, her voice shaking despite herself. The sheriff's gaze dropped, and for a moment, he looked older than she'd ever seen him, like the years had finally caught up all at once. "Canyon Massacre," he murmured again, the words heavy with memory. "It was supposed to be a routine escort, 5 deputies, 3 prisoners, and the marshal riding lead, but they never made it to trial. Found what was left of 'em days later, horses scattered, camp burned to ash, every man shot or worse. Cole's body was never buried proper. Folks said it was the Apache, others said it was bandits. But there were whispers, dark ones, about a man who betrayed his own." He looked up then, his eyes bloodshot and wet. "And if that badge is real, if Cole's walking again—" He didn't finish. The words turned to stone in his throat. Clara's breath came shallow, her mind spinning. "Why would he know my name?" she asked. "I wasn't even born then." The sheriff shook his head. "I don't know, and I don't want to. Whatever this is, it ain't natural." He turned away, crossing to the window, his reflection pale in the dirty glass. "You listen to me, Clara Vance," he said, voice low and hard. "You take that badge and you bury it deep, deep enough the dead can't reach for it again. Forget the trail, forget the man. You start asking questions about Ethan Cole, and you'll bring the past howling back with teeth." Clara's fingers tightened around the silver star, its cold bite against her skin making her flinch. Outside, thunder rumbled low across the plains, the kind that rolls before a storm too big to see yet. She looked at the sheriff, sweat beading on his brow, fear twisting his voice, and for the first time, she realized this wasn't just superstition. Something in him had broken at that name. And though every instinct told her to leave it buried, she knew she couldn't. The dead had whispered her name once, and she had the feeling they weren't done speaking. The sun was sinking low when Clara reached the spot along the trail where the stranger had fallen, the same stretch of hard desert earth that only last night had been slick with blood and shadow. She slowed her horse to a stop, the dry wind tugging at her hair, the world around her silent except for the faint hiss of sand drifting across the rocks. For a moment she just sat there, staring, waiting for something, any sign that what she'd seen hadn't been some fever dream. But the ground was bare. No footprints, no scuffed dirt, no blood soaked into the dust. Even the place where his body had lain was smooth, untouched, as though the desert itself had swallowed him whole. Her heart began to pound harder, a dull ache building in her chest. She slid off the saddle and knelt where she was certain he had been, running her hands over the earth, feeling the warmth of the day still clinging to it. Nothing. Not a drop of blood, not a torn scrap of fabric. No, she whispered, shaking her head, her fingers digging deeper, desperate to find proof that the night before had been real. She could still remember how heavy he'd been, how his breath rattled against her shoulder as she lifted him, how his hand had caught her wrist just long enough to whisper her name. The voice was burned into her, low, broken, familiar in a way she couldn't explain. And yet here, now, there was nothing to show for it. The desert stretched in every direction, endless and empty, painted gold and crimson beneath the dying light. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of dust and sage, and for a moment she thought she heard something hoofbeats far off, faint as memory, but when she turned, the horizon was bare. The silence that followed felt wrong, too still, too careful, as though the land itself was holding its breath. She stood slowly, brushing grit from her knees, her throat dry with more than heat. He was here, she said aloud, her voice small against the vastness. He was here. Her mare flicked an ear, restless, sensing her unease. The wind rose again, stronger this time, pulling loose strands of her hair into her eyes and lifting the sand in small whirls that danced across the ground. It felt like the desert was erasing him piece by piece, scrubbing away every trace until even she would start to doubt what she'd seen. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the horizon, the ridges of red stone to the north, the dry creek bed to the west, the scattered cacti standing like sentinels against the dying light. Somewhere out there, something waited, something that didn't want to be found. She could feel it in her bones, an unease crawling through her that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. She took the badge from her pocket, the silver star glinting faintly even in the dimming light. It was still warm, as though it carried the memory of the man's blood. Marshal Ethan Cole, she murmured, tasting the name like a secret. What do you want from me? The wind answered with a low sigh that made her shiver. She wanted to believe the sheriff was right, that this was just madness, that she'd imagined it all, but as she looked down at the badge in her hand, something deep within her whispered that the truth was far from over. She slipped it back into her coat, mounted her horse, and turned toward the canyon to the west, the place where old stories said the massacre had happened. Behind her, the trail disappeared beneath the shifting sand, wiped clean again as if warning her to turn back. But Clara tightened her reins and rode on, into the wind and the gathering dark, chasing the ghost of a man the desert refused to remember. The next morning, the town lay beneath a pale haze of dust and heat, the kind that made every shadow look thinner, every sound sharper. Clara rode in before noon, her eyes hollow from a night without rest, and her fingers still curled tight around the badge in her pocket like it might burn her if she let it go. She hadn't meant to come back to the sheriff's office so soon, but something about the silence of the desert, the way the wind had swept clean every trace of the man, had driven her here, chasing proof that she wasn't losing her mind. When she stepped inside, the air smelled of old paper and gun oil, and sunlight slanted through the blinds in long, dusty stripes. The sheriff wasn't there, just the low hum of the ceiling fan and the soft ticking of the clock above his desk. She hesitated, then moved farther in, her boots creaking on the worn floorboards. That was when she saw it, the framed photograph hanging crooked on the far wall, its edges yellowed with age. The image faded but still clear enough to recognize the proud line of a dozen men standing shoulder to shoulder. The lawmen of another time, their badges shining even in the sepia gloom, the kind of photograph towns took to prove to themselves that order had a face. She stepped closer, heart tightening as she read the small brass plate beneath it. Territorial Marshals, 1,874. Her gaze moved along the row of faces, some hard, some young, some already tired of the world, and then stopped cold. Third from the left, hat tipped back, mouth set in that same grim line she'd seen by the firelight, was him, the stranger, the man she'd dragged from the trail. The same sharp eyes, the same scar cutting along his jaw, Marshal Ethan Cole. For a long moment, she just stared, the breath locked in her chest. It didn't make sense, it couldn't make sense. That photograph was 20 years old, and the sheriff himself had said the man was dead. But there he was, captured forever in that frozen moment, the same face that had whispered her name in the dark. Her hands began to shake as she reached up to touch the glass, fingertips brushing the faint outline of his image. "You were here," she murmured. "You were real." Behind her, the door creaked open, and the sheriff's boots thudded against the floor. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, his voice hard but laced with something else, weariness, maybe fear. She turned to face him, her hand still resting on the photograph. "You knew him," she said. "You worked with him." His eyes flicked to the picture, then back to her, and for the briefest second, something flickered in his expression, guilt, old and heavy. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "Longer than you can imagine." "He's alive," she said. "I found him on the trail. He was bleeding, dying, but he knew my name, Sheriff. He said it before he passed out." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You listened to me, Clara. Whatever you saw out there, it wasn't Ethan Cole. That man's bones are dust in the canyon." She took a step closer, anger mixing with confusion. "Then explain this. Explain how he knew me. Explain why the desert took every trace of him." He didn't answer. Instead, he walked past her, pulled the photograph from the wall, and set it face down on the desk. "Some things don't stay buried," he muttered. "And some ought to." She opened her mouth to protest, but he lifted a hand, his voice trembling slightly now. "If he's truly back, it means what happened at Canyon Ridge ain't finished. And if that's the case, girl, you best pray you're not part of it." His words hung heavy in the still air. Clara's pulse thudded in her ears as she looked down at the face in her mind, the eyes that had found her through pain and death and time itself. Maybe the sheriff was right, maybe some things were better left buried, but as she turned and walked out into the blinding light of midday, she knew the truth had already started to dig itself free. The warning should have stopped her, but by the time the sun began to set behind the far ridge, Clara already had her mare saddled and the badge tucked deep in her pocket, its weight pressing against her like a heartbeat she couldn't ignore. The sheriff's words, "Stay away from Clearwater Canyon," echoed in her mind, carrying the kind of fear that only came from truth. He'd spoken of it like a curse, his voice dropping low, his eyes flicking toward the window as if something might be listening. But the more he told her to forget it, the more she felt the pull, a strange, almost magnetic tug, as though whatever haunted that canyon was calling her by name. The trail west was long and lonely, stretching through miles of dry brush and red stone that caught the last light of dusk like fire. By the time she reached the old crossroads, the world had gone quiet except for the wind whispering through the mesquite. The signpost pointing toward Clearwater Canyon was barely standing, its letters half faded and riddled with bullet holes. Folks said no one went that way anymore, not since the massacre. The mines had closed, the settlement abandoned, and time had stripped what was left to bones. She urged her horse forward, the animal snorting uneasily as the air grew colder the closer they rode. The moon rose slow and pale, painting the desert silver, and soon the canyon mouth yawned before her, a jagged split in the earth that seemed to breathe darkness. She dismounted, tying her reins to a sun-bleached post, and stood for a moment at the edge, listening. The wind here didn't sound like wind. It moved through the rocks in a low, mournful hum that prickled her skin. She stepped forward, her boots crunching over broken glass and rusted tin, relics of a town that once had life. A few crumbling structures still clung to the canyon floor, a saloon with no roof, a blacksmith shed half buried in sand, and at the far end, what might have once been a jailhouse, its door hanging loose on a single hinge. As she moved closer, the scent of old smoke hit her, ash buried deep in the soil, the ghost of fire long extinguished. She knelt and ran her fingers over the ground. It was scorched. The massacre hadn't been just a fight, it had been a burning. Something about the silence pressed against her chest, heavy and watchful. Every step she took felt like trespass. Then, beneath the pale moonlight, something caught her eye. A faint gleam near the base of a ruined well. She approached, crouched low, and brushed away the dirt until the edge of metal glinted back, a cartridge casing, polished by years of wind. She picked it up, turning it between her fingers, and froze when she saw the engraving on its base, U.S. Marshal Service. Her breath hitched. This was real. Cole had been here. She stood, scanning the shadows, half expecting to see him step from them. The same blood-stained coat, the same eyes that had looked straight through her soul. But the only movement came from a tattered sign swinging above the saloon door, its faint creak breaking the silence. Clearwater founded 1869. A gust of wind pushed through the canyon then, sharp and cold, and the faintest whisper rode on it a man's voice, low and broken, saying her name. Clara. She spun, heart hammering, the cartridge falling from her hand. No one was there. Only the sound of the wind fading back into stillness. She stumbled backward, her breath coming fast, staring into the dark mouth of the jailhouse where the echo had seemed to come from. For a moment, she almost turned back but then she thought of the photograph on the wall, the face that shouldn't exist, and the promise burning beneath her fear. She stepped forward again, deeper into the ruins, each footfall a vow. Whatever truth the sheriff wanted buried, she would find it. And if the dead were calling, then she was done pretending not to hear. The sun was sinking low when Clara spotted the cabin half buried in red dust and shadow, slumped against the hillside like a dying beast too stubborn to fall. The walls leaned inward, riddled with bullet holes that caught the last rays of light, turning each splintered gap into a tiny flare. Her mare snorted and stamped, uneasy, and Clara couldn't blame her. The air around the place felt wrong, heavy, like the earth itself remembered what had happened here. She dismounted slowly, her boots crunching over shards of broken glass and shell casings rusted to brown. A buzzard wheeled high above, silent against the fading sky. For a moment, she stood there, the wind tugging at her coat, and wondered if she was walking straight into the ghost of the massacre itself. Then she pushed open the door. It creaked loud, long, and lonely, the kind of sound that made the hairs rise along her neck. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old smoke. Sunlight streamed through the bullet holes in long golden shafts, catching on the floating motes, so that everything shimmered faintly half real, half memory. A table sat overturned, chairs broken, the floor littered with old brass casings and dark stains that time hadn't managed to fade. Someone had fought hard here. Someone had died here. But it wasn't just the ruin that stopped her heart, it was what sat on the far side of the room, half hidden beneath a torn coat and a layer of grit. A leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, the edges blackened by fire, but when she brushed it clean, she saw the faint embossing still visible on the front. E. Cole. Her breath caught. With trembling hands, she opened it. Most of the pages were ruined, the ink blurred, the writing reduced to ghosts of words. But near the end, a few lines remained scrawled in a shaky, unmistakable hand. She traced the letters with her fingertips, whispering them aloud as the twilight deepened around her. Clearwater was not the end. They think me dead, but the fire spared me for a reason. There's a truth buried here, deeper than bones, and she carries the key. Clara froze. The handwriting was clear, firm, deliberate, and the date below it stopped her breath entirely. 3 days ago. Her pulse thundered in her ears. That was impossible. The man was dead. Everyone had said so. Yet here was his name, his words written fresh, the ink barely faded. She carries the key. Her mind raced. Did he mean her? How could he have known she'd come? She turned the page, searching for more. But the rest was blank. Only a smear of dried mud and something darker staining the corner. Her fingers trembled as she closed the book and stood, the silence pressing tighter around her. Outside, the last of the sun slipped behind the canyon rim, and shadows stretched long and hungry across the ground. The mare whinnied nervously, pulling against the reins. Clara tucked the journal into her satchel, her heart pounding. She knew she should ride back, tell the sheriff, bring proof, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That somewhere in the deepening dark, Marshall Cole was watching, waiting. As she stepped outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and the distant, haunting echo of gunfire, faint, like a memory reborn. She turned toward the canyon trail, the fading light painting the horizon blood red, and whispered to herself, "You're not dead, are you?" The wind answered with a low, hollow sigh that might have been her imagination or might not have been. She swung into the saddle, clutching the journal tight against her chest, and rode toward the dying sun, the promise of answers and ghosts pulling her deeper into the dust. Clara sat by the dying campfire, the journal open in her lap, the fading light of dusk spilling across the pages like blood over parchment. The entries were jagged and broken, whole sentences lost to time and weather, but the story they told was clear enough to make her skin crawl. It wasn't the Apaches who'd slaughtered the marshals at Clearwater Canyon. It wasn't bandits, either not at first. It was one of their own. "We rode in under promise of peace," Cole had written, his words slanted and desperate. But the gold from the mining claim never reached Fort Carmine. Someone spoke before we arrived, someone who knew our trail. We were ambushed by those we were meant to arrest. The gunfire came from both sides, friend and foe alike. Clara's breath hitched as she read the next line, her pulse quickening with each letter. "I saw his face through the smoke. A man I called brother. He fired first." The ink bled there, as if the pen had pressed too hard, and beneath it, one final scrawl. "I will heal. I will return. Justice waits for no man, but I'll make it wait for me." She sat frozen, the night closing in around her, the meaning sinking deep into her bones. It hadn't been a massacre born of chaos. It had been murder planned, deliberate, personal. Someone had sold out Marshal Ethan Cole and every man under his command. And if Cole's promise meant anything, he hadn't been a ghost at all when she found him. He'd been a survivor, crawling his way back through 20 years of hell to finish what betrayal had started. Her eyes flicked to the last line again. "A man I called brother." The words echoed in her mind, sharp and cruel. That could only mean one thing. Whoever had betrayed Cole had been close. Another marshal, maybe even someone who'd worn the same badge now resting in her coat pocket. And if that man was still alive, still walking free, then he had to be in town, because where else would a guilty man hide but among the ones who believed him righteous? A sudden gust of wind stirred the dying embers, and the fire flared just long enough to throw her reflection in the journal's cover. Her own face stared back at her, wide-eyed, pale, and beneath the glow of the flame, she thought she saw something else, a faint shape beside her, tall and shadowed, like a man standing watch. She spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Only the whisper of the wind sliding through the canyon grass. She snapped the journal shut, her hands shaking. It was madness. All of it, ghosts, blood oaths, vengeance crawling up from the grave, but the truth pulsed too strong to ignore. The sheriff had known something. His fear hadn't been about superstition, it had been about exposure. And now, every man who'd served under him, every lawman who still carried a badge, looked different in her mind, suspect, dangerous. She doused the fire, the smell of smoke and ash clinging to her as she stood. The canyon around her was black now, save for the faint glimmer of starlight. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, long and mournful, and the sound seemed to twist through her ribs like a warning. She saddled her mare, the journal heavy in her bag, and turned toward the east where the lights of town flickered faintly in the distance. Her throat felt tight as she whispered into the night, "If you're still out there, Marshal, I'll finish what you started." And though no one answered, the wind that swept down from the canyon carried with it the faintest murmur of approval, low, distant, and old as the desert itself. Clara stormed into the sheriff's office just as the last light of evening bled through the slats of the blinds, turning the room to stripes of gold and shadow. The journal was clutched tight in her hand, its leather cover still warm from her grip, her pulse hammering like hooves against the dirt. The sheriff looked up from his desk, and for the first time, she saw him not as the calm, calculating lawman who'd warned her away, but as a man already haunted. "You've been digging where you shouldn't," he said quietly, voice gravel, thick, though his eyes betrayed something sharper fear. "I found the truth," Clara said, her tone shaking more from conviction than nerves. She slammed the journal onto his desk, opened to the page that carried Cole's last entry. The sheriff didn't move for a long moment, just stared at the words like they were ashes of something he'd tried to forget. Then, with a slow exhale, he sank back in his chair, the years suddenly heavy on his shoulders. "So it's true," she said, her voice low. "Cole wasn't killed by bandits. He was betrayed." The sheriff's jaw flexed, his gaze distant. "You don't know what you're stirring, girl." "Then tell me," she snapped. "Because I'm done with lies. He wrote this 3 days ago, He's alive. Or was. He said someone he trusted shot him first. The sheriff's head lifted at that, and for a heartbeat, there was something raw in his expression, something close to pain. He rubbed a hand over his face, sighing through his teeth. Ethan Cole was more than a marshal to me, he said finally. He was my teacher. My blood might have come from my pa, but my backbone, my sense of right that came from him. When I was young, he took me on as his deputy. I thought he was untouchable. I thought the badge meant something. His eyes flicked to the badge pinned to his chest, dull in the dim light. Then Clearwater happened. Everything went to hell, and I found myself staring at the bodies of men I'd known my whole life. Cole's coat was there, burned. His horse was gone. We thought he was dead. His voice faltered, thickening. But the truth, what you read in that book, he wasn't wrong. He was betrayed, and not by some outlaw, neither. It was my own brother. Clara froze, her stomach twisting. Your brother? The sheriff nodded once, slowly, like each motion cost him something. Thomas, he said, his tone hollow. He wore the badge too, rode with Cole that day. But he'd been making deals with the Kettering gang for months, gold, land rights, protection. When Cole found out, he meant to bring him in. Tom couldn't let that happen. He tipped the outlaws off, led Cole's men straight into the canyon, and when the first bullet flew, it came from his gun. His voice cracked on the last word, and he pressed a hand to his mouth, trembling. I buried what was left of that story because I couldn't stand the thought of my own blood being a murderer. Folks said Tom died that day too, and I let him believe it. He looked up at her then, and his eyes were wet, his fear no longer hidden. If Cole's alive, Clara, he ain't coming back for justice. He's coming back for revenge, and I reckon he'll start with me. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. Clara's throat went dry as she studied him, the man she'd known her whole life, now laid bare as part of the very thing he'd sworn to protect her from. Maybe he has the right, she whispered. The sheriff flinched but didn't deny it. Maybe, he said softly. But that don't change what comes next. Outside, thunder rolled low over the desert, the first promise of another storm. Clara stepped back, her hand brushing the journal as if to steady herself. Then I'll find him first, she said. The sheriff's gaze snapped up, alarm cutting through his grief. Clara, don't. But she was already at the door, the wind from the gathering storm tugging her hair loose, the sky beyond the window turning black as smoke. If he's still breathing, she said, her voice steady now, he deserves to know the truth. And with that, she was gone, leaving the sheriff alone with his ghosts, the journal's pages fluttering in the draft like restless souls whispering the name of the man who'd risen from the grave. The sound came just before midnight, soft, steady hoofbeats rolling through the hush of the plains like a heartbeat returning from the grave. Clara jolted upright, the oil lamp still burning low on her bedside table, her pulse thudding in her ears. For a moment, she thought it was a dream, the echo of her own guilt shaping itself into noise. But then her mare whinnied from the corral, nervous, and she knew someone was out there. Grabbing her rifle, she crossed the room, her bare feet whispering against the floorboards. Through the thin curtains, she saw the outline of a horse standing still beneath the moonlight, and beside it, the figure of a man. Her breath caught. He was tall, shoulders broad, wearing the same tattered duster she remembered, though now it was clean, whole. The blood that had soaked it long vanished. His hat shadowed his face, but even in the dim light, she could see his eyes sharp, cold, and unmistakably alive. Clara pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking like a warning. The night air was cool, the scent of rain heavy on the wind, and the mist rising from the canyon drifted around them in pale, ghostly ribbons. You, she whispered, lowering the rifle but not the tension in her hands. I buried you in my mind. The man smiled faintly, a weary curve of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. Reckon I've been buried before, he said, voice low and rough like gravel. Doesn't always take. The moonlight glinted off the silver badge pinned to his chest, the same one she had found, impossibly polished now, shining as if it had never touched blood or dirt. You shouldn't be here, Clara said, though she couldn't tell if it was fear or wonder that made her voice shake. The sheriff, he said. I know what he said, Cole interrupted gently. He told you about the betrayal. About his brother. His gaze drifted past her, toward the cabin, the flicker of lamplight dancing on the walls inside. There's more to it, girl. There always is. Clara stepped closer, her throat tight. Then tell me. For a long moment, he was silent, watching her like a man deciding whether to trust the living. You did me a kindness, he said finally, his voice softer now. Dragged me from the dirt. Gave me breath when the earth had near claimed me. That took courage. But courage comes with a price. His hand brushed the brim of his hat, and his eyes gray and endless as storm clouds locked on hers. The one who betrayed me walks again. The words hit like thunder, shaking something deep inside her. What do you mean? She asked. Your killer's dead. The sheriff said. No. His tone was final, heavy with certainty. The canyon burned, and I burned with it. But some sins don't die easy. Thomas lived. He took a new name, buried his badge, and made himself a lawman again. His gaze darkened. He's been walking free all these years, hiding in plain sight. Clara's blood ran cold. The sheriff? Cole didn't answer. He just held her stare, letting the silence finish the thought for him. You can't fight him, she said, her voice breaking. He's not the same man he was. Cole's eyes softened, not with forgiveness, but with something heavier acceptance. Neither am I. The mist thickened around them, swirling like smoke, and when she blinked, he was already mounting his horse, his outline fading into the gray. Marshall, she called, stepping forward. What do I do? He turned one last time, the moon catching the silver of his badge, the faintest trace of sorrow in his smile. Find the truth, Clara, he said. It's the only thing worth saving. Then he was gone, swallowed by the fog as if he'd never been there. The sound of hoofbeats fading into the vast, waiting dark. Clara stood in the doorway long after the night had gone silent again, the wind whispering through the canyon like a voice she could almost understand. And for the first time, she realized some ghosts didn't haunt out of vengeance. They haunted because justice hadn't finished its work. The dawn broke cold and pale, the kind of light that made everything look washed out, brittle, and false. Clara rode into town with the weight of the night still heavy on her chest, her mind echoing with the marshal's words, the one who betrayed me walks again. She'd barely slept, her dreams haunted by the sound of hoofbeats and the gleam of that impossible badge in the moonlight. But as she turned the last corner toward the sheriff's office, she felt the world go still in a way that made her stomach twist. A small crowd had gathered, shopkeepers, ranch hands, the preacher's wife clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. Their faces were pale, eyes wide, whispering behind trembling hands. Clara dismounted, her boots hitting the ground hard. What happened? She asked, but no one answered. It was the blacksmith, Tom Reed, who finally spoke, his voice low and uneven. It's the sheriff, he said. He's gone. She pushed past them before they could stop her, the wooden steps creaking under her weight, and when she shoved open the office door, the air inside hit her like ice. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, but the smell, iron and gunpowder, filled the air thick and unmistakable. The sheriff sat slumped in his chair, head tilted back, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. The bullet hole was clean, centered just over his heart, but it wasn't the wound that froze her blood, it was what gleamed against his vest. A silver badge, polished bright and pinned neatly over the heart that no longer beat. Marshal Ethan Cole. Her breath caught in her throat. The same badge she'd found in the dirt, the same one Cole himself had worn when he appeared in the mist. For a long, hollow moment, she could only stare, her pulse roaring in her ears. Oh, God, she whispered, her knees threatening to give. Behind her, footsteps creaked on the floorboards, but she didn't turn. The blacksmith's voice came again, faint and shaking. Locked door. No one saw a thing. Gun still on his desk. One shot fired, but not from it. Folks are saying it's a message. A message. Clara's gaze dropped to the desk, to the papers scattered across it, the half-written letter lying open beneath the sheriff's lifeless hand. His handwriting was jagged, rushed. He's back. I can't hide it anymore. If you're reading this, I'm sorry. It should have been me. Her throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes as the words blurred. He'd known, He'd known his brother was alive, known that the sins of the past had finally come calling. "Thomas," she whispered. The name felt strange in her mouth, like a curse. Cole's brother, the real traitor, had returned. The sheriff had carried his guilt for 20 years, protecting the memory of blood he couldn't wash away, and now the reckoning had come. But was it Cole who had delivered it? Or the ghost of the man who'd worn the same face, the same family name? The thought twisted through her like a knife. If the marshal had truly meant to kill the sheriff, why leave the badge his badge as proof? Unless it wasn't vengeance at all, but a warning. Justice isn't finished. She backed away slowly, the murmurs from outside growing louder, the first whispers of fear spreading through the crowd. "It was the marshal," someone said. "He's come back from hell itself." But Clara knew better. She could feel it deep down, that cold, instinctive truth that made her skin crawl. The marshal hadn't done this. His words echoed in her mind again. "The one who betrayed me walks again." The killer wasn't a ghost. He was flesh and blood, walking free beneath the same sky. And now, with the sheriff dead, there was only one person left who knew enough to stop him. Clara turned toward the door, her jaw set, the first streaks of sunlight spilling through the windows like fire. She'd chased a ghost into the desert and found a living monster wearing his face. Whatever it cost, she would finish what Cole started, because justice, once awakened, didn't sleep again. The wind was sharp that morning, carrying with it the scent of rain and sage as Clara stood over the two graves, her coat flapping against her legs like a restless spirit. The prairie stretched wide and empty around her, the sky the color of pewter, heavy with clouds that promised another storm. The sheriff's coffin, simple pine, unvarnished, rested beside an older mound of earth, marked only by a weathered stone that read Thomas Cole. 1,850, 1,874. The irony of it cut deep. For years, the town had mourned a man they believed dead, never knowing that his ghost had lived on in the skin of the brother he'd betrayed. Clara knelt in the dirt, the cold seeping through her skirt, and stared down at the silver badge lying in her palm. It gleamed faintly in the weak light, edges worn smooth by decades of service and suffering. She could almost feel the weight of both men pressing against her, the sheriff, burdened by guilt and blood, and Marshal Ethan Cole, bound to the earth by vengeance and duty. "You were brothers once," she said softly, her voice trembling as the wind rose. "And somewhere along the way, you both forgot what that meant." She set the badge between the graves, pressing it into the soil until only the star's tips caught the light. "This is where it ends." Her throat tightened as she spoke the words, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to the dead or to herself. For a moment, the wind stilled, the air hanging thick and breathless, and then it moved again, hard and fast, swirling around her like a sigh of release. The dry grass bent low, the dust lifting into spirals that danced over the graves, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw two shadows standing side by side on the ridge, one tall and proud, the other bent but unbroken before the light shifted and they were gone. Clara rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands. The journal lay tucked in her saddlebag, its pages safe but unread beyond the final entry. She didn't need to see more. She understood now what the marshal had meant when he spoke of debts and justice. Some wrongs couldn't be undone, only carried until the truth was finally spoken aloud. The sheriff had tried to atone in silence, hiding behind his badge, but silence had its price. It had taken a stranger's courage and a dead man's promise to settle what the law couldn't. She walked to her horse, the leather reins cool beneath her fingers, and paused once more to look back. The graves sat side by side beneath the gray sky, the wind sweeping over them in mournful rhythm, and the badge between them caught one last glint of light before the dust began to cover it. "You can rest now," she whispered. "Both of you." Swinging into the saddle, she turned toward the open land beyond the ridge. The horizon stretched endless and wild, the kind of place where stories faded into myth and names were carried only by the wind. As her horse started forward, the sound of hooves echoed through the emptiness, steady and sure. Behind her, the prairie kept its secrets, but the truth, raw, painful, and final, was no longer buried. She didn't know where she was headed, only that the badge had passed its burden to her now, not as a curse but as a reminder that in the West, Justice wasn't written in law books or earned through power. It was paid for in blood, in loss, and in the courage to face what others tried to forget. And as the wind howled across the plains, carrying dust, memory, and mercy alike, Clara rode on into the gray dawn, knowing that some debts in the West were never truly settled, but some, if you were brave enough to face them, could finally rest in truth.